on, Laura. Don't you want to play?
Why do we always have to play Ring Around a Rosie?
Because I say so.
25 dangers Gen X faced. Here goes my vote. The boomers would make you believe that they faced the worst dangers among others. These are the 25 dangers Gen X faced that were worse than baby boomers. Number 25. Everyone smoked all the time, even the ones who didn't. The young Gen Xers either tried their best to avoid inhaling all the secondhand smoke or pretended to smoke with cigarette candies. Didn't want kids to be left out at family gatherings, right? If you asked them about it, they'd probably mention how they fought with their siblings on road trips over who gets to sleep on the car's floor. Why? Because parents smoked with the windows down, so kids fought to lay below smoke clouds and attempt to get comfortable on that stupid hump. Smoking was widely accepted in hospitals. Every room, hallway, and lounge was filled to the top with smoke. It was normal for physicians to smoke while examining patients, and mothers smoked during labor and delivery. Nobody was spared from cigarette smoke on airplanes either. Taking a flight in the 70s in the U.S. meant that almost every grown-up would light up a cigarette once the fasten seatbelt sign turned off. Number 24. Kids adjusting the TV antenna on the house roof. TV sets used to be so bulky, high maintenance, and almost constant readjustments had to be made, either inside the house or on the roof. You might be familiar with the bunny ear-looking antennas above old school TVs.
And every time you split a signal, you're essentially cutting the signal in half, so adding more TVs into the mix just compounds the problem.
But did you know that they also needed a large, complicated network of wiring and large antennas on the roof of the house too? Oftentimes, readjusting the bunny ears antennas on top of the TV was enough to regain signals. When it was not, though, parents would often tell their most agile children to climb up on the roof and readjust the antenna. Sounds unsafe, but let's add the fact that there was no direct line of communication between the parent and the child on the roof. Yeah, so they had to form a line of family members yelling out directions in sequence from parent to roof child. Imagine doing that on a rainy day and thunder striking you Frankenstein style. Number 23. Steel playgrounds existed for decades. Playgrounds today are so cute and safe, unlike the mostly steel ones Gen Xers grew up with. We're sure you're already thinking, how could children play in the summer? Or wouldn't they get injured from sharp corners? And you are right to worry about that. But kids back then were much tougher, and some would say smarter than the recent generation's lot. Still, kids would get the worst burns from the slides or handlebars being too hot. We can bet you thought a plastic slide's burn was bad enough. The winters were not too pleasant either, especially in places that snowed. Kids back then were still kids, and they found it funny when their playmates got their tongue stuck on a freezing steel bar. To make matters worse, 12 feet tall slides or swing sets with rusty chains and linkages were common. Tetanus was clearly not on top of any playground designer's mind. Number 22. Whiskey for teething babies and snotty kids. Many Gen X parents believed in the magic of whiskey when it came to childcare. It was a staple home remedy that mothers from the 60s to 80s would swear by. You may have already heard about this if you already have kids now, maybe from your grandmother or aunt when they strongly suggested that you rub some whiskey on your teething baby's gums. Parents in the past would even give whiskey-covered chewy toys to their toddlers. Whiskey was a staple home remedy for the flu, fevers, body aches, and more. There's even a popular recipe most people call Grandpa's cough syrup, which was a shot of whiskey with a spoonful of honey and lemon juice. Most former snotty kids would say it worked, but it was not worth the hangover. Most over-the-counter cough syrups today used to contain plenty of alcohol, like NyQuil when it was part 50% proof alcohol. Number 21. Female employees were always overworked, disrespected, and fired. We all know that women from Generation X, and those before them, often got treated like scraps at the bottom of the barrel, sometimes in their own homes and almost always outside it. For too many years, women had to face intense discrimination in the workplace. They were laid off for being on maternity leave, spoken to and touched inappropriately,
It could be a sign that she enjoys your company on a level that goes beyond mere workplace politeness. The extra mile in communication.
And held back deliberately from promotions and better pay by their superiors. Women were treated much worse for requesting the same things given to men without question. That includes health and medical insurance, paid days off, and early leaves for emergencies. It is an odd generation, with grandmothers who were only expected to be homemakers, never received higher education or worked a job. Their own mothers had the option of attending university, but they were never taken seriously for it. Their lives still revolved around marriage and child-rearing. Number 20. Children getting injured was usually annoying for parents. Most of the Gen X adults today tend to think that the newer generations are overly insulated from experiencing any kind of hurt until their later teen years. Of course, in the same breath, they would laugh about how their parents left them unattended to play with the neighborhood kids, babysit siblings, or be completely home alone. They might be right about children today not having enough coping mechanisms to deal with getting hurt, but they also believed that the walk-it-off approach was no good either. It is one thing to be left unattended as a kid, but it sure does hurt when a parent gets annoyed by your injuries. We've heard countless childhood injury stories from Gen Xers in which their parents delayed taking them to the hospital, even if they were in immense pain. And once they did go to a doctor, they'd find out they had a bad sprain or a broken bone.
What happened?
That's it, I pushed him off Aaron.
No, you didn't. Like that to get him off? How can you expect Brenda to step back and allow you to do discipline?
Number 19. Lawn darts were one of many dangerous games. Most families in the 70s indulged in a variety of games that are the equivalent of colorful weapons. Sharp, pointy objects were deemed good enough to be sold as toys, such as lawn darts. The worst part is that children threw them around on a daily basis with almost no supervision, while Dad was at work and Mom cooked dinner. Good old days. Unfortunately, these fun-looking stabbers were pulled off the shelf and replaced with non-pointy versions in the late 1980s. There was a complete ban on pointed metal darts across the U.S. Lawn dart injuries accounted for approximately 675 ER visits per year during their production and sale. The most common injuries were to the head, specifically the eyes and face. Over half of these injuries resulted in hospitalization, sometimes caused blindness, brain damage, and were even fatal. It is still estimated that there are at least 10 to 15 million sets of lawn darts across the U.S., stored away in garages or old toy boxes. We'd say it's high time we get rid of them for good and forget their existence. Number 18. Sun damage was not a common concern. You must have heard from at least one Generation X person that kids these days keep looking younger and younger. And they are absolutely right. Kids these days hardly spend nearly half as much time as Gen X children did under the sun.
Dr. Shirazi gave us some simple tips like wearing a daily moisturizer with an SPF of 30 or higher, but she also showed us how technology...
Even if they did go out, they are lathered in no less than SPF 60 sunblock cream. That reaction alone is enough proof of the damage the sun can do to our skin. Unfortunately for them, they were not aware of just how bad sun damage can be. Even the most popular sunblocks of the time reeked of coconut oil and exaggerated the extent of sunburns on people's skin. Speaking of, people loved the bright, scorching sunlight so much that teachers and women used to cover themselves in coconut oil to speed up the tanning session. Kids used to compare sunburns and have skin-peeling competitions. Number 17. Treating scraped knees with mercurochrome. If you grew up during any period before the 1980s, you must remember those tiny brown bottle with a stained and sketchy label, looking like it came out of a medical kit that also once contained tourniquets and a bone saw. We don't think anybody ever had a new-looking bottle of mercurochrome. It was a staple in many Gen X childhood homes to treat all sorts of injuries, from tiny cuts to full-on open wounds. It used to be sold as an antiseptic, except it was literally mercury. Was mercury poisoning not always considered dangerous? Apparently not. Many of your older family members would tell you that it never harmed them, and that being poisoned by mercurochrome is a myth. They even still call it monkey blood, which honestly makes it sound much less scary. Not only was it toxic,
After cleaning the wound and applying petroleum jelly or a similar ointment, cover the skin with an adhesive bandage.
But also caused a searing, burning sensation. For that very reason, the term Satan's spit is much more fitting. Number 16. Lack of safety equipment while helping Dad in the garage. Many Gen Xers share similar childhood memories of helping their father in their home garage. It's not always the brightest memories, though. During those times, we already knew that safety was not the first thing on everyone's minds. Most adults of the time thought that as long as nothing bad happened yet, there was no need for safety equipment or measures. Many recount stories of how they'd take big, scary falls from ladders or drop heavy things on themselves, such as mattresses. Some would tell you that they got a nasty scar on their forehead from slipping on some old car engine oil. Another common memory is how their dads and grandpas would pour kerosene over cuts and scrapes. It surely sounds absurd, but we've even heard stories of cutting wood with saws without safety goggles and masks. It would either result in itchy eyes or stuffy noses with boogers the color of sawdust. Number 15. Kids adventuring hours away from home, unattended. Well, like we've discussed earlier, it was the norm to let kids play and roam about the neighborhood without adult supervision. Gen X was one of the last generations to have had complete freedom as children to play and explore far away from home. Their parents never asked them where they went or who they played with, as long as they got back home before sundown. It sounds crazy in today's context, during a time in the world when parents cling onto their children for dear life out of fear of kidnapping, injury, or any one of the countless ways a child can be harmed. During most periods before the 1980s, parents felt that as long as they lived in nice communities, there was nothing to worry about. But with the rise of the 24-hour news cycles and crime reports through media, children were suddenly viewed as vulnerable, and the following generations became much more protective. Number 14. Running around razor-sharp water sprinklers. In stories told by our elders, raised between mid-1960s and early 1980s, playing around water sprinklers is portrayed as the best summer activity from their childhoods. But this is the era around the 1970s we're talking about, so you know there's something dangerous about it. One of the risks related to the pressure and force of the water jets in the sprinklers, especially those connected to high-pressure hoses or systems. The forceful impact of the water could cause bruises, skin irritation.
There's something inside of my foot.
Abram's tanning. Are you tanning, Abram? Case, we need a tweezer.
And even more serious injuries like cuts or eye damage if the kids got too close to the sprinkler head. Even if their parents could control the water pressure, the kids would repeatedly slip and fall all around the sprinkler. Best case is they get a bruise or a sprained ankle, but the worst case scenario is they fall right on the sprinkler head, which is usually sharp and razor-like. Number 13. Giving kids aspirin was not so taboo. In the 1970s, aspirin was believed to be safe and effective medication for children, used for reducing fever and alleviating pain. Of course, today we would never give aspirin to children, but if you ask any Gen X adult now, they would confirm it. It was fine until the early 1980s that medical professionals learned that a rare but severe condition known as Ray's syndrome was increasingly affecting children medicated with aspirin. Ray's syndrome is a disorder that causes acute brain and liver damage, usually after viral infections like influenza or chickenpox. Gen X children surely witnessed, experienced, and some even survived the effects of aspirin on their little bodies. Lucky for us, medical professionals quickly tried to prevent any more damage from aspirin in children and advocated for alternative medications such as paracetamol, which involved negligible risk of triggering Ray's syndrome. No wonder Gen X is one of the toughest generations today. Number 12. Casting toy soldiers out of molten lead.
Before it's made into paracetamol glutathione, it's made into a precursor called N-acetyl P-benzoquinonamine, or more simply, NAPQI.
Lead casting soldier kits were mostly popular in European countries, such as Germany, all the way to the States. These soldier kits were popular among children and craft and figurine hobbyists for their creative, hands-on way to craft miniature figures. They came with molds, lead alloy pellets, and a heating device to melt it. Simply put, the way it worked was that the lead alloy pellets were kept in a small furnace or ladle above the heating device until it became molten. Then, the metal was carefully poured into the soldier molds. Once the metal cooled and became solid again, the figures were ready to be demolded and painted to add detail and realism. Sounds great, but children melting lead is all around awful. Lead poisoning can happen easily by ingestion, inhalation, or skin contact. Young children are vulnerable due to the impaired neurological development and long-term health problems caused by lead poisoning. Number 11. Firecrackers were considered harmless toys. Quite recently, we heard from a friend who grew up in the 1970s that they used to break their action figures or dolls in half, like G.I. Joe, and shove firecrackers in between them. Then they'd set them down after lighting the firecracker and run away to wait and watch their dolls get launched like melting plastic rockets. Such fun! We don't think so. Well, yes, it would be fun to make things explode, but
We're renovating the house. We do that a lot. We did it once. TV.
we also know how unsafe that is for a child. But perhaps back then parents were much more trusting and felt their young kids were grown enough to not get burned or blast off their hands. So as any parent would strongly advise against now, Gen X kids' parents would send them down to the corner store with money to buy their own firecrackers and bottle rockets anyway. Number 10. Chemistry sets with actually dangerous chemicals. From the colorful reactions to the occasional safety hazard, these sets left a lasting impression on countless young Gen X scientists. Many older chemists and scientists would tell you that these sets weren't just about fun, but they are what sparked an early interest in science and taught them basic principles like mixing solutions and observing chemical reactions. The popularity of chemistry sets has seen ups and downs over time. While they were once a staple gift encouraging scientific curiosity, their productions have greatly reduced in recent years, thanks to the stricter safety regulations and changing educational trends. Can you imagine kids today trying to play with those sets? They'd probably burn your house down. The chemistry sets Gen Xers grew up playing with, especially those from before the 1980s, included toxic and harmful substances like mercury or lead compounds. Adults today would not attempt to use bleach without safety gloves and a mask. And you mean to tell me it was okay for kids to play with mercury and lead just...
By doing this, the vapor quickly began to condense in the condenser.
decades ago? That's insane. Experiments from those old chemistry sets also included some flammable substances or reactive chemicals such as potassium, permanganate, and glycerin. Vintage chemistry sets included low-level radioactive materials like uranium or radium paint. We wonder how many childhood bedroom carpets were charred or turned radioactive from all that. Number 9. Drunk driving was a brag. Youngsters today might think their elders are exaggerating when they'd say that driving after a beer was normal back in their day. While it is treated as a serious offense today to drive under the influence of any substance, the 1970s were much more lax about it. Ask anyone who grew up around that time, and you'd most probably get the same answer. Dads often drove unless they were too drunk to even walk straight, and that was only the case if the family tagged along to the bar or the least drunk of their friends would drive. It used to be considered a brag by many youngsters and middle-aged adults back then to be able to get themselves home by driving drunk. We don't see the humor in it, but it is not surprising. In an era where children played with lawn darts, were left home alone, or given latchkeys, drunk driving is only one of the less wild stories you can hear about. Societal norms and awareness around the irresponsibility and dangers of drunk driving were hardly existent before and during the 1970s.
Taylor, this is your specimen, the one that you elected to take away with you. It's going back into your own personal property, because until such times as you blow a clear...
Drinking through any hours of the day or night was a lot more socially acceptable and less regulated. Media and entertainment only made it worse by depicting drinking and driving in a less serious light than it is perceived today. Number 8. Seatbelts were not always mandatory. There was a time in recent history, more like 40 years ago, when seatbelts were not a mandatory component in cars. And up until the 1990s, seatbelts were not compulsory to wear. but only recommended. Crazy to think that not enough people were concerned by the possibility of being shot through your car windshield in a car collision. The lack of seatbelts meant that the driver and passengers were vulnerable to severe or fatal injuries from car accidents. Head injuries, fractures, and other trauma that could have been mitigated or prevented with proper restraint were at an all-time high when combined with a rising trend of drunk driving in the 1960s. Generation X were only young children or babies at the time, and many of them felt like the world was out to get them. From dangerous toys to sitting in a car, there was always danger around their corner. When people began noticing the rising rates of fatal injuries in the 1970s, the awareness of the life-saving potential of seatbelts led to the public advocacy and legislative actions we know of today.
At the dawn of this new legislation, rush hour motorists on Merseyside were greeted by foul, snow-filled winds.
In response to evidence brought forward by researchers and car safety advocates, governments began implementing laws for the installation of seatbelts in new vehicles. Number 7. Asbestos walls, ceilings, and everything. During the 20th century, particularly from the 1900s to the 1970s, asbestos was favored in construction of homes for its fireproofing and insulation properties. It was used in various ways, such as insulation, roofing, flooring, and ceiling tiles. You might be surprised how Generation X and their predecessors survived the asbestos era. It was also commonly used in automotive parts, textiles, and household appliances. Unfortunately, after many decades of constructing and using this material, it was discovered to be extremely dangerous. Asbestos is fibrous in nature, and when disturbed, the fibers can become airborne and ingested or inhaled. The tiny fibers are very durable, which makes it possible for them to penetrate deep into the lung tissues. Exposure to asbestos led to a large number of people suffering from respiratory diseases, such as asbestosis, lung cancer, and a rare cancer called mesothelioma. These diseases typically have a long latency period, which means it takes decades to manifest after initial exposure. Construction workers, asbestos miners, shipyard workers, and insulation installers were regularly and directly exposed to asbestos, no thanks to the lack of safety regulation and equipment. Still, though, secondary exposure was almost just as harmful, and it would go unnoticed.
The green shimmer of a fresh-picked sample indicates the richness of this magic mineral. Asbestos is the product of nature's factory.
Family members of workers were exposed to it through asbestos fibers brought home on clothing. Number 6. Radioactive paint and jewelry. Between the 1960s and 1980s, radioactive paint and materials were pretty common in products like watches, clocks, and jewelry. These types of watches were especially popular amongst military personnel because they would illuminate in the dark without requiring any external light sources. Radium-based paint was the winning ingredient for its luminescent properties and was mostly used to paint over watch dials. Radioactive paint also happened to be used in children's toys, and you might have heard about glow-in-the-dark paint that your parents might have used. Of course, we now know that the use of radioactive materials comes with serious health risks. The radiation from them can penetrate tissues and cells when ingested, inhaled, or with prolonged exposure. This leads to long-term consequences such as cancer. The worst thing about radioactive paint and materials in children's toys was the gradual degradation of these items over time. When paint deteriorates enough, it could flake off and release many radioactive particles. These particles are often not visible right away and could be small enough to be ingested or inhaled. Workers in industries that manufactured these products and the paints used in them had it worst. There was a time when a factory hired female factory workers who would dip brush in radioactive paint.
We're just using tempera paints for the parents and the art kids at home. We like using tempera. It's a good paint for kids.
And soon after moisten the brush tip with their mouths. Number 5. Cars with faulty exhaust systems and carbon monoxide leakages. It used to be bad enough that adults smoked in cars with children and kept the windows up. The fact that children used to sleep on the car floor to avoid inhaling endless clouds of cigarette smoke is pretty sad too, but one more thing Generation X had to put up with was terrible cars. We know cars as recent as the early 1990s were not half as good as the ones we're used to in 2024. But did you know that cars prior to the 1980s were much, much worse? Some Gen X adults will tell you about the terrible exhaust systems in their childhood cars, if you ask. Now, imagine a child having to inhale cigarette smoke and potentially carbon monoxide. It sure is a recipe for disaster, be it immediate or later on in life. Cars with faulty exhaust systems were responsible for many carbon monoxide poisoning while driving, which highlights a period of tragic incidents related to vehicle emissions. If a person drove long enough in a car that was releasing carbon monoxide through the AC system, they wouldn't even realize it and possibly pass out while the car is running. Carbon monoxide is an odorless and colorless gas that can be lethal in high concentrations because of its affinity with red blood cells. This reaction disrupts the oxygen uptake in the bloodstream. Number 4. Food safety was far below being safe. Food safety and consumer awareness since Generation X's childhoods.
This, by the way, is what happens when someone asks for toast. Psst, watch closely. It's all done by mirrors.
Have been through some major transformations, driven by the dangers of increased consumption of processed foods. Younger parents in the past few decades voiced concerns over their safety and nutritional value, especially after seeing the long-term effects in previous generations' health. Processed foods gained popularity during and in the immediate post-war eras due to their convenience and longer shelf life. The economic decline and scarcity of resources due to war bred these desperate needs in families across Western society. Unfortunately, many of these products contained additives, preservatives, and artificial ingredients that later on raised doubts about their health implications. Artificial food colorings and flavorings also caused allergic reactions and behavioral issues, especially in children. Foodborne illnesses from improper food storage, packaging, and processing were another serious issue Gen X had to face. The lack of sanitation practices and regulations led to outbreaks of Salmonella and E. coli. Let's just say, we are relieved to be lucky enough to not have grown up in those times. Labeling and transparency about ingredients were also not honest and transparent compared to today. People had almost no way to find out information about the nutritional content and potential allergens in processed foods, which made it harder to make smarter dietary choices in an already difficult time. Number 3. Veteran war survivors left to fend for themselves. War veterans today don't get the best treatment and assistance.
Your mental collapse was not seen as shameful, and diaries of soldiers indicate that they did care for their friends, they nurtured them if they thought that they were.
But it is still nowhere near as bad as it used to be for Gen X military personnel. Their generation has faced multiple wars and being called for mandatory service at the young age of 18 years old. They faced significant negligence and inadequate support once they came back home from military service. The perception of mental health issues among veterans were believed to be signs of weakness rather than serious psychological medical conditions. PTSD, then referred to as shell shock or battle fatigue, was very misunderstood and stigmatized. Some of these veterans had to partake in more than one war during their youth, most of which had succumbed to their battle wounds or ended up disabled people. Physically wounded veterans encountered the worst neglect, since medical care and rehabilitation services were far from even being subpar. Many Gen X veterans returned home with serious injuries, such as limb amputations or severe burns, only to face challenges in accessing the required health care or specialized treatment facilities like we have now. Many Generation X veterans were met with bigger misfortunes, such as homelessness, due to their inability to get back into the workforce or contribute anything else to society. It was not even their fault, though. They were left to fend for themselves. Number 2. Mental health was never talked about. We remember when PTSD, which was previously known as shell shock or flashbacks, was considered to be a phenomenon only linked to being involved in military combat.
After the war, you tended to get more stories about
other forms of trauma were considered to be less harmful, which is extremely harmful in the long run to begin with, and so they were not considered to be PTSD. For way too long, the stigma around mental health has been overpowering. If you thought mental health lacked support today, you would have hated growing up side by side with Gen X. They could not say too much, or seek proper help because they'd get dismissed or thrown in an asylum. If someone witnessed domestic violence or were in a major car accident, that was not considered bad enough to cause trauma or PTSD. All the grown-ups back then would say, at least you didn't have to live through active combat situations. Even if someone back then was in a bad enough condition to receive professional help, psychiatric treatments prior to the 1980s are so controversial by today's standards. They were traumatic, extreme, and sometimes harmful enough to be fatal. Procedures like lobotomies, electroshock therapy, ice water or hot water baths, and institutionalization in psychiatric hospitals were paired with poor conditions and mistreatment of patients. All that stigma and negativity would cause any one of us to emotionally shut down. Number 1. Domestic violence was tolerated as a private marital issue. Generation X and those before them faced the worst societal attitudes towards domestic violence. Things were painfully different compared to today, which used to be a culture of neglect and minimization of the struggles of domestic violence victims.
Guess what me and Andrew found?
Where have you been, young lady? You're late.
Huh?
I asked you where you've been.
Well, I was trying to tell you, me and Andrew.
The fact is, you're late.
I know I'm...
Domestic violence within intimate relationships was viewed as a private matter between two people rather than a serious crime. Victims faced numerous barriers to seeking help or escaping terrible situations. In turn, that resulted in Gen X growing up with tendencies to deny their emotions, cope in various ways, but refuse to open up about their pain. They were raised with the belief that marital problems should be resolved within the family unit, leading to pressure on victims, who were usually mothers and their children, to stay silent. And if the victims were male, they had the worst of it all. Fortunately, we now live in a time where men and women could find someone to help them out. The neglect of domestic violence victims prior to the 1970s, made up until the early 1990s even, brought about the emergence of the women's rights movements and advocacy groups dedicated to raising awareness across the globe. These efforts laid the foundation for legislative reforms, public awareness campaigns, the establishment of domestic violence shelters, and support networks for victims as we know them today. These were the 25 dangers Gen X faced. Comment below if you think we missed something you encountered. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel.